Welcome into Locked On Knicks. Per a Woj report, Gavin, Donovan Mitchell might be available for trade.
What would the package be? Do the Knicks have the leverage necessary to pull this off? And would they be good enough for this to all be worth it? We'll talk about all that and more right now on this big, important edition of the Locked On Knicks podcast.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome into Locked On Knicks. We want to thank you guys for making Locked On Knicks your first listen today and every day, whether you're checking us out on your favorite podcast platform or taking in the sights and sounds on YouTube. We appreciate you guys making us a part of your daily routine. I'm Alex Wolfe. I'm editor-in-chief of Knicks site The Strickland, which you can find at thestrick.land. He is Gavin Schall, your favorite play-by-play broadcaster's favorite play-by-play broadcaster, and we are breaking down some rumors today. Big rumor day, not just for the Knicks, but I guess just for the NBA in general. Anytime a star name comes up, that always happens. But yesterday, a report breaks from Woj saying that Donovan Mitchell is apparently more available than previously believed, that Utah is taking calls on him. I don't think this should come as a surprise to anybody. So I guess, Gavin, that's probably a good point to, jump off on here. Like, did this surprise you at all? It didn't really surprise me. I kind of figured that Mitchell had to be available because I don't understand why you would make the Gobert trade and then still say, with the guys that they got back and everything, say, oh yeah, we definitely still think we're going to compete this year. Like, Walker Kessler could be great as a rookie, but still isn't even going to come close to replicating what you had with Gobert. And I think they would have been fighting an uphill battle to convince Mitchell that this was an actual contending team.
Yeah, Alex, I agree with you. I think part of my slight surprise at this was that I did believe Utah, and still do to some extent, would be legitimately okay holding on to Donovan Mitchell. Obviously, still has 3 years left on his deal, is still only 25 years old. They could theoretically, if they choose to go down this path, could repackage all those assets they got from Minnesota and turn them into maybe a running mate that gives them a higher ceiling with Mitchell than Rudy Gobert did. That being said, you look at Danny Ainge's history as a general manager, and he doesn't really do anything halfway, right? With the Celtics, when the Big Three era was over, he didn't say, all right, we're going to trade KG and we're going to trade Rondo, but we got to hold on to Paul Pierce for nostalgia. He was like, no, we gotta start over, and we have to like completely revamp this team and give ourselves a base for the next great Celtics team. And much to our chagrin, it worked out pretty well for them, getting Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown with those Brooklyn Nets picks. So I think he's trying to do something similar in Utah, trying to give them the best asset base in the NBA this side of Oklahoma City. And you know what? If they can pull off a trade similar to what they got for Gobert, that would be very feasible. But Alex, to me, that is the question. Do they actually have the leverage to pull off a trade similar to Rudy Gobert? Even if in a vacuum, Donovan Mitchell is the more valuable player, who would the New York Knicks be competing against that they would elicit that kind of package? I look around the NBA landscape, and I don't necessarily see the team that could push the Knicks to Utah, or rather to Minnesota S lens, or certainly not past that anyways.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the first thing is, if you think that Mitchell is definitively more valuable than Rudy Gobert too, you know what I mean? I think there's a real case to be made that like Gobert holds, I mean, this isn't just me pandering to our boss who loves Rudy Gobert to death, David Locke, but, Gobert holds a lot of value in the NBA. I think maybe more so than what we generally think based off the value of the center position and stuff. It's a multi-time defensive player of the year, well earned, honestly, I think. And regardless of some of the limitations that you run into with him in the playoffs, like it's not like Mitchell doesn't have his limitations too, particularly on the defensive end, with not being able to hold his, end of the bargain up on that end a lot of times, particularly in the playoffs and stuff. So, I think that's where things will start with the trade package. Like, does the initial reports that were coming out after the Gobert trade was like, oh, well, considering this is what the Jazz got for Gobert, they're going to want like double that for Mitchell. And that's just unrealistic. Like, it's going to really depend on, is Ainge going to be realistic about Mitchell's value, or is he going to be, unrealistic and hold this like crazy high standard that no team is going to meet, like 7 first-round picks or something. You know what I mean? Like, that's just never going to happen. So I kind of, I'll be curious to see how things progress with what the trade value is going to be, because leverage is another thing too, Gavin. Like you said, like, what teams are really in the running here? I think it's the Knicks, who have positioned themselves pretty well, and like, I'm fully ready with fork in hand to eat some crow if they wind up parlaying all those picks that they got in the the super protected picks that they got in the trade out on draft night into kind of juicing up a trade package to make it look better for Mitchell. Then I'll totally eat crow on that. Like, and be happy to that, that those picks were able to be used for something really productive. But other than, the Knicks, who obviously have the asset trove that they do, the Heat are rumored to be interested, and their potential package is basically like Tyler Hero, and that's it. Like, they have very few picks that they're at any liberty to trade at this moment. And then who else would even insert themselves in the conversation, right? Like, is Orlando or is OKC or one of these other teams that has like a bunch of assets hanging around going to throw their hat in the ring at this point for a Mitchell type player? Like, do they think that would actually be a difference maker for them? I don't think OKC does that. I still think OKC's plan is tank for Wembanyama. Like, that's been Presti's like dream and what all this has been building towards. I think you could probably say the same for, teams like Orlando that were bad last year, and even with a top pick on their team, probably will be bad this year. That I don't think that they're going to really like empty the clip right now to go after a Donovan Mitchell. So I think it basically is like a 2-horse race, unless maybe like Brooklyn inserts themselves in the conversation, tries to turn, a KD deal into a 3-teamer to get Mitchell back to them, or maybe tries to trade Simmons for Mitchell or something, but and try to lure KD into staying with them or something. I don't know. It's weird, but I feel like it basically seems like a 2-horse race between the Knicks and the Heat, and I don't know how much leverage the Jazz have in that scenario, considering not too many teams that are involved can even come close to matching the picks, the sheer volume of picks that the Knicks can offer. And I'll let you respond to that in just a second, Gavin, in our next segment. But first, I got to let everybody know that this episode is brought to you by RockAuto.com. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, you guys know it's impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. How could they possibly fit all those parts in such a tiny little store? I don't know how they pull it off, but auto parts stores are always like the smallest possible store when you go into the brick and mortar locations. And why would you want to endure all the pointless and intimidating questioning and the prices and having to wait for your part and then drive back to the store to go pick it up? It's just not a fun experience. You can save time and money when you use Rock Auto. Why would you want to spend 30%, 50%, or even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership? On top of that, Rock Auto is a family business. They've been serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and their prices are reliably low for every customer, not just for mechanics. So if you go to Rock Auto that you're going to be getting a good deal. So go to rockauto.com right now and you can see all the parts available for your car or truck. And if you decide to place an order, write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, Gavin, I'll throw it to you to open this segment. How do you feel about that as far as the Jazz leverage in this scenario? Like, do you think that they have a means to really shake the Knicks down here, or do you think that the Knicks could sort of find themselves in the driver's seat of this scenario?
No, I think two friends of the show, Jonathan Macri and Prez, in a newsletter and on Twitter, respectively, did a really good job breaking this down. And I mean, as you did as well, you go through basically the rest of the league, and there just isn't an obvious team. I look at someone like Memphis as being theoretically interesting if they wanted to get a big three of their own. And it wouldn't be like in some ways it'd be like, well, we just saw the Nets try to do that. It didn't work out. You'd have a much younger group in Ja Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Donovan Mitchell. And they just have so much depth that I think they could make the case to themselves. Like, all right, even if we have to trade a Desmond Bain and like one other really valuable young piece, like a Brandon Clark and like a bunch of picks, we just have so many good young players that we can do that. I don't know if for Utah that would necessarily be more appealing than what the Knicks could offer, where the Knicks could just offer more picks than that. Maybe Bain is good enough to justify that kind of deal. Personally, I would rather have Bain than Tyler Hero. So I think Memphis, at least in my mind, could be the dark horse here. But that would bring up a lot of the same questions that the Knicks have, where you look at a backcourt of Ja Morant and Donovan Mitchell, and you just say, all right, like if we're going all in, we want to be, if not the clear-cut championship favorites, we want to be very much in that stratosphere. And I just don't know if it makes them that much better, because as good as they'd be offensively, defensively, I think they have a lot of the same questions that Utah did, where they have this stud at center in Jaren Jackson, but their backcourt is just going to get scored on over and over and over again, unless one of Mitchell or Morant makes a really significant leap. So that is the first team I went to. Miami is obviously the name here, is the team that's been reported to have a ton of interest, but I don't really see it with Miami, where they don't have, I believe, unless I'm way off, that they have all their own picks, but they don't have any extra picks, unlike the Knicks. And in terms of guys they can actually trade, are they willing to throw Bam Adebayo in that deal? Because I don't think Tyler Hero is enough for me as a centerpiece of that trade, unless you're just sending back an outlandish number of picks. And on top of Tyler Hero not being a centerpiece, the Knicks have a bunch of like tertiary guys that they could throw in, whether it's a Grimes or a Cam Reddish, who Grimes obviously much more so than Reddish, but if you're the Jazz, should interest you a little bit. I just don't really see those dudes on the Heat roster that you could trade for him and say, oh, that guy has a lot of upside. If we're in a rebuilding situation, he could potentially be someone who emerges as a secondary piece for us down the road, or someone that we can start this rebuild around. I just don't see that dude on Miami. It would take Danny Ainge looking at Tyler Hero and saying, hey, I see an all-star. I see a guy who honestly isn't that much worse than Donovan Mitchell. Personally, I don't have Hero in that stratosphere. Maybe Ainge does, but if he doesn't, again, you're talking about a situation where Utah really doesn't have a lot of leverage, because I think as time goes along, Mitchell is only going to lose value. You get closer and closer to the end of that contract. You get closer and closer to a scenario where Mitchell publicly asks out. And at that point, it's not really the same thing as Utah, at least right now, allegedly trading him from a position of strength where they can at least make the argument of saying, hey, like if we go back even earlier into Danny Ainge's tenure with the Celtics, we're going to do what we did with Paul Pierce, where they traded Antonio Walker. They traded the core of what was that early 2000s Celtics team that was pretty good, and said, even if it takes 4 or 5 years, we're going to rebuild around this guy. He's going to be a Jazz for life. You get closer and closer to the end of that contract. You get a Donovan Mitchell who's more and more frustrated, be completely out of the spotlight. I just think the trade package is going to get worse and worse, because there just isn't a clear-cut team that's going to desire Donovan Mitchell more at the end of this season than they will right now. Maybe that happens, but it would be kind of a bold bet for Danny Ainge to make. So, Alex, I'm in total agreement with you. I think the question is next, given that, what would the package be that the Knicks would reasonably have to give up to go and get Mitchell?
Well, I'll also just say, too, the Heat are, they're not in a great spot as far as picks go. They have no second round picks of their own going forward from the look of things. And they also still have their first round pick outgoing to Oklahoma City, which is in 2025, which is protected 1-14 in 2025 and fully unprotected in 2026, which doesn't super affect their ability to deal picks after that, but it does to some degree. And then they obviously also have their own 2023 pick, which they can include in a deal, which I feel like would not carry so much value, because that the Heat are going to, they were the number 1 seed this past year. If they're adding Mitchell essentially just for Hero and picks, they're still going to be good this year. So I don't feel like that pick would carry too much value.
Yeah. And that was the one thing I forgot to note. Like the Knicks are still perceived around the NBA as, if not a laughing stock, is so far from a sure thing. Their picks are going to be more valuable than I think the vast majority of teams that would trade for Mitchell. And conversely, to your point, Miami, not just in the immediate future, but in the deep future, they're pretty much the gold standard in the NBA of a team that doesn't lose and never gets bad. So I would argue their picks have maybe less value than any other teams in basketball.
Yeah, it would be like them, like
Golden State.
Golden State, I guess now, like now the Golden State's out of their like mini tank for a couple years, and Milwaukee maybe, I don't know, like it's very hard to find teams that are more consistently like in the playoff mix than the Heat. So I think you're right. Like I can't think of too many teams that would have less valuable first round picks than them, because Riley just kind of always finds a way, even from the scrap heap, to put together a at least fringe playoff team every single year, along with Spoelstra. So if we're talking about what the package could end up being, I mean, I guess we would have to start with like the Gobert package and build our way from that, right? Like, so Gobert, they wound up getting 4 first round picks that were, I think, all unprotected. I'm actually pulling up the deal at the moment to see what they wound up getting in total, but it was like
I think
4.
They got 5 maybe with the swap too.
I think it was 4 plus a swap. So if you're building it off of that, and then the players that they got, which was Malik Beasley, Walker Kessler, and I mean, was anyone else? Yeah, Bolmaro, I guess you could count as sort of Beverly, yeah, a useful NBA player. So if you start building off of that, I think you could start looking at like, okay, so what are the veterans that the Knicks would include that could either go to the Jazz or be rerouted? I think Randall obviously comes up like first and foremost. And, would the Jazz have interest in him? I don't know. But I do think, the first thing that comes to my mind is get LA involved as a third team, the Lakers, that is. And because they're in a desperate situation. They have Russell Westbrook, who I don't think they have any interest in bringing back next year, making $40 million or 45 or whatever the hell he's making now. If you can offer them an avenue where you could say, all right, we'll send you guys Julius Randle. Utah, you guys are now clearly trying to tank this year anyway. So would you take back Russell Westbrook and buy him out? Or maybe they even try and do like a Chris Paul thing and, give him the floor and just say, resuscitate your value and we'll try to find a new home for you or something around the deadline. Whatever they want to do, if they're willing to be the place that Russell Westbrook goes, I think you could probably get LA to attach some more picks to him, whether it's, a fistful of second round picks or, maybe one of I think they could trade 2027 or 2029 with some level of protection on it. Maybe they send that to, increase the pick haul for Utah, but I think that's a sensible fit. Other than that, just from salary matching purposes, maybe you start looking at like Derrick Rose, and that's certainly a guy I think LA would be interested in too. If it was a 3-teamer, if they could trade Westbrook plus a first round pick plus, whatever else to get Julius Randle and Derrick Rose and try to extend this LeBron and AD title window a little longer, maybe they do that. Because I don't think that's too high of a price to pay given the upside in their case. And then for the Jazz, obviously they'd be looking at some of the young players on the Knicks. Does that mean Grimes? Does that mean Quickly? Does that mean Obi Toppin? I don't know what their priorities would be, but I would think that at least one of those 3 would probably have to be outgoing. If I'm looking at it in a vacuum, I would probably prefer Emmanuel Quickly to be that guy at this point, just because I think if you're looking at the roster and how it's going to be constructed after this trade is over, do you really want 3 undersized guards that are going to be taking up the majority of your like 1 and 2 guard minutes? I don't know. I mean, I think it gets a little dicey if you're talking about Brunson, Mitchell, and IQ is getting like basically all of your 1 and 2 minutes. Maybe you can work in, Deuce McBride a little bit or something, but he's in the same mold. He's also undersized, so it's like, I don't know if I would want to bank so hard on having an undersized guard rotation like that. I feel like I would rather, if you could put Quickly in and keep Grimes at this point, even if I don't necessarily think Grimes' ceiling is this high, I think he would be a much better on-court fit and long-term fit with those guys. Obviously, if you make this trade, you're committing to a Brunson and Mitchell backcourt for quite some time. So that's a direction I would potentially look to go. Other than that, I think it just comes down to pick haul. And I think you can, on paper, if you're just looking at it as quote unquote first round picks, you can beat the sheer volume that Minnesota gave up for Gobert and potentially give up like quote unquote 5 first round picks or something like that. But it's going to mean, you're trading probably the Washington pick, which is heavily protected for a number of years. You're probably trading the Detroit pick, which is heavily protected for a number of years. The Milwaukee pick, which is top 4 protected in 2025. And it seems foolish to bet on Milwaukee getting that much worse. And, I guess then you could say like 2023 Knicks unprotected, maybe a pick swap in there too. And maybe another first round pick at the Dallas pick too probably would go out. So you'd probably be sending like 4 2023 picks, quote unquote, to Utah for this, but 2 of which in that Washington and Detroit ones wouldn't be projected to convey for a while. So I think that would probably get it done though. And like, I don't think I would say no to that, because honestly, if the Knicks basically just give up their excess of picks with those protected ones, plus like one of their own, they're not even like totally pick barren to where they can't make another deal down the line. And they're also not youth barren. Like they would still have a number of good young players on the team that could potentially develop. You still have Jokic, who could come over from Europe and like tear it up and become a good young player for you. So I would honestly, if it was quote unquote 5 first round picks and it was those picks I just mentioned, I would probably be down for it. But Gavin, I'll let you respond to that. But probably first off, I would imagine that our good friends at BetOnline are going to have some odds on where Donovan Mitchell can end up pretty soon.
Yeah, maybe start pouring some money on the New York Knicks. The website is betonline.net, and they are your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs and Major League Baseball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And betonline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. And they have some new odds up for everyone, including the Coach of the Year, our boy Tom Thibodeau. Alex, I'm looking. He is literally not. Oh, he's 50-1. Sorry, he's 50-1. So you know what? If the Knicks go get Donovan Mitchell, they're the 2 seed. Maybe throw some money on Tom Thibodeau winning his second Coach of the Year in 3 seasons. Once again, the website is betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. And with that, we are back on Locked On Knicks. Alex, I will say my ideal trade for Donovan Mitchell is very, very similar to what you just threw out there. I had written down here before the show: Emmanuel Quickley, Julius Randle, Cam Reddish, New York Knicks 2023 first round pick unprotected, the 2023 Dallas first round pick, the 2023 Wizards / Pistons first round picks, which are obviously pretty heavily protected, both quite unlikely to convey in 2023, the top 4 protected 2025 Bucks first round pick, and unprotected, 2025 Knicks first round pick, and swap rights in 2026 with the New York Knicks for the Utah Jazz. Is that enough? I'm not sure. But to your point, in the aggregate, if you're the New York Knicks, you are sending out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 first round picks plus a swap. I would argue that Wizards and Pistons, those picks combined, are the equivalent of basically like one bad first round pick, like one Heat first round pick, essentially, just because they're so unlikely to convey. And there's a world, unless I'm misremembering the protections on those, where they turn into 2 seconds. I think that Bucks pick is maybe a little bit more valuable than we initially thought on draft night, just because it is a few years off and it is only top 4 protected. And to your point, I think Julius Randle in that trade essentially functions as someone, if you're Utah, who either from the Lakers or from another team whose value you could really play up in a year, like the Jazz can just sort of surround him by guys who are willing to give him the ball and kowtow to him. I have a feeling he'd put up absolutely monster numbers there and would be dealt for another first-round pick. Cam Reddish is someone you can rehabilitate and either keep and deal for a first-round pick. And Emmanuel Quickley, I think, is honestly a fantastic young piece. The question with Quickley, which kind of circles back to Stephen Bondi's reporting around the draft, how much do teams around the league value him? What is the value gap between Quickley and Hero? Obviously, even though I'm sure you and I would argue that if it's anything, it shouldn't be very much between those guys. I have a feeling teams around the league value Hero significantly higher, but it's possible that Ainge is a general manager that looks at Quickley and sees at the very least like a competent starting point guard and someone who has a ceiling for something more. And at that point, I think it becomes a very plausible deal. And again, if you're the New York Knicks, it's sort of the same thing with the Kevin Durant saga. You do not have to outdo the Gobert trade, even though just because of the age gap, I would argue Mitchell's the better asset. You don't really have to outdo any other trade. You just have to say, all right, you guys are in a position where it seems like you're ready to let him go. And I think these reports from Woj are a good indicator that Utah's not really happy with what the current market is for him, and they want to get blown away. They want that monster offer. If that truly gargantuan deal that just blows you away is not out there, it's very plausible that this is the best that Utah gets. So, Alex, I think that brings us to our final question. How good are the New York Knicks if they acquire Donovan Mitchell, only giving up Emmanuel Quickley, Julius Randle, and let's say Cam Reddish as the guys who will play for the New York Knicks today if the season started?
I mean, I think they'd be pretty good. That's kind of what I was just saying in the last segment. Like, luckily, on the surface, at least, again, I'm in full agreement with you. Like, I don't think that the Wizards and Detroit picks are like worth that much. That said, I still would probably balk at giving up that extra unprotected first round pick that you did in your proposed deal, just because I don't think Mitchell is that guy, and that would be sort of the issue with this trade is, are you trading for another guy that's sort of like Carmelo Anthony in a sense of really good, really entertaining, is going to give you a higher floor. Like, I think the Knicks would have a floor of being a playoff team then, even if it's like an 8 seed, as long as they stay healthy. But, is he good enough if you're giving up that much to really bank on being like the franchise savior? That I don't think so. I think that he's more of a finishing piece than a centerpiece. You know what I'm saying? Like, I would want to have someone else in tow that's like better than Donovan Mitchell already. And maybe RJ Barrett ends up that way. I'm not willing to put a cap on RJ's ceiling when he just put up 20 points per game in his third season, and looked down the stretch like he could actually be an offensive engine for a team with a little bit of refinement. So, maybe RJ turns into that guy and Mitchell brings out the best in him by taking so much scoring burden off of him while being a little more conducive to, him getting his opportunities on offense more so than what Julius Randle was. So, maybe that raises how good the Knicks could be, but I still think they would be pretty deep, even if they trade, if it's IQ, Randle and Reddish that go out. Reddish doesn't project to be that super, involved anyway. And like Randle is, he's obviously, you're replacing his usage and stuff with Mitchell. So that's not, and you're elevating Obi, who played so well to end last year. So I think that could actually be a plus, because Obi, I think, plays the role better of being a third scorer sort of thing in that lineup, or even fourth now, if you consider Brunson too. I don't know. I would be a bit worried about defense. I think Mitchell Robinson would really have to carry his weight and all that. But I think if the Knicks stayed healthy and the pick package is more the centerpiece of the Mitchell trade, and they still are able to keep a lot of their roster intact, I think even with Tibbs as the coach still, they could probably milk 45 to 50 wins out of the team if they really, do as well as they should. Because there's a lot of talent on that team, point blank. I mean, the Knicks would be a really talented team in that case. And if they're well coached and are able to put it together defensively, especially, I think they'd be in good shape. So, yeah, I would say I would put their ceiling at like 3 or 4 seed or something like that, and I would put their floor as like a low seed playoff team. It would feel very similar to what the Knicks' ceiling and floor sort of used to be in the Melo years to me. And obviously, then they would need to make that next level move to take that next step. And I do think they would still have a good deal of ammunition to do that, with still a number of good young players on the team and still most of their own picks going forward, even if they blow the surplus stash on Mitchell. So I would feel pretty good about it. I think that's my main answer. I think they could still potentially be a pretty good team, and have at least a high floor, if not necessarily the highest of ceilings.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I mean, this was a point Prez threw out on Twitter, and I agree with it. Look what Tibbs got done. To Tibbs' credit, as much as we rip the guy, with pretty much subpar starting defensive talent the last few years. Top 3 defense in 2021, and your backcourt that year was what it was Elfrid Payton and it was RJ Barrett for most of the season. And then last year, I mean, you start Evan Fournier, you start either Alec Burks or Emmanuel Quickly. And can we say definitively that Brunson and Mitchell is dramatically worse than that? I don't know. It depends on how much Tibbs can motivate Mitchell, because we've seen it from him. I mean, mostly at the college level, but for flashes in the NBA, I think Mitchell can be at his best an average defender. That doesn't sound like much, but you think Brunson is something close to that. It's not as much of a disaster as it would be on a surface level. Granted, there are guys you go against in matchups in the Eastern Conference, like the Bucks, who are super big, the Celtics that are super big, that you'd have issues guarding. But those teams would also have a heck of a lot of issues guarding the New York Knicks. I mean, you look at the firepower the Knicks would be bringing off the bench, with Grimes coming off the bench, with Fournier coming off the bench, Isaiah Hartenstein, who's maybe not a star, but a really nice offensive center, Deuce McBride, who's flashed in summer league, some elite level pull-up shooting. And then that starting lineup, to your point, just 1 through 4. I think you legitimately have 4 guys in Obi, Jalen, Donovan, and RJ who can score 20 plus points per game. And what I'm looking at is, if I want to feel good about this, is what Donovan Mitchell did in that 2021 season, where he averaged 26 points per game, 5 assists, 4 rebounds, shot 44% from the field, 39% from 3, 85% from the line. And that was a Jazz team where if Mitchell had stayed healthy in the playoffs, who knows? They might have been in the finals that year. I think it's fair to question Mitchell's ceiling after what was undeniably a disappointing season a year ago. But Mitchell at his best, like, we were talking about him as someone who was in that Jason Tatum range a couple of years back. And I think in an ecosystem where he's happier with ideal surrounding talent in a good defensive infrastructure, that Mitchell Robinson has shown he can anchor, if not at a Rudy Gobert level, at something pretty close to that when he's playing at his best. Again, the Knicks were somehow a top 3 defense down the stretch last season. You're looking at a team that has a ceiling that is maybe just the Eastern Conference Finals, but I don't know. I think with the right series of moves could be a little bit higher than most people think. And the final question is, what is the alternative for the New York Knicks? You just wait this out forever and you hope these young guys make the jump. I've said it over and over again, but at some point you just have to make the swing, and this might be the best opportunity for the Knicks. But we'll wrap it up on that. Alex, thank you so much for everyone for listening. We'll have a whole lot of coverage of Summer League. Our guy, Albert Gim, coming on tomorrow of No Ceilings. So we will talk with him about NBA Summer League and so much more. So stay tuned to Locked On Knicks. But until then, be good.